Nessa found the egg on a Tuesday, which was the least dramatic day of the week, to find something that would change the world. She was hauling water up from the river when she saw it half buried in the mud at the bank's edge, pale grey, about the size of a melon, cracked along one side where something had already tried to hatch. The crack was still wet. Whatever was inside had given up somewhere between trying and dying. She set her buckets down. She looked at the egg for a long time. Nessa was 31 years old and had been doing difficult things since she was 9, which was when her father stopped coming home, and she became the person who made sure her younger brother Pell ate at least once a day. She did not call herself brave. She called herself practical. There was a difference. Brave people acted on feeling. Practical people acted on information, and the information here was that something alive was in that egg barely, and the river was cold enough to kill it by nightfall. She picked it up and carried it home in the front of her coat. The village of Dunmore was small enough that everybody knew everybody, which meant everyone also knew everybody's business, which meant that by morning half the village knew the river woman had brought a dragon egg into her house. The other half found out by noon. Nobody came to ask her about it, which was not the same as nobody caring. In Dunmore, people expressed concern by gathering in the road outside your door and talking loudly about something else. Pell came by in the evening. He was 23 now, broader in the shoulder than she was, and still looked at her the way he had as a boy, like she was the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. "Show me," he said. She showed him. The egg was sitting near the hearth, wrapped in the wool blanket she used in winter. The crack had widened overnight. Something had pushed at it from inside. Pell stared at it for a long time. Then he said, "You know what it is?" "Yes." "You know what the holders will do when they find out?" "I know what they'll try to do." The holders were the 3 families who ran Dunmore, not elected, not appointed, simply old enough and wealthy enough that no one had ever successfully pushed back. They had a rule about dragons, the way they had rules about everything. Any dragon near the village was a dragon that needed to be driven off or killed. It was not cruelty. It was a policy born from 2 bad decades, 40 years back, when a nesting pair had claimed the valley as territory and the village had burned 3 times before someone managed to drive them out. The holders remembered this. The holders had been building that memory into law ever since. Pell said, "What do you want to do?" Nessa said, "I want to keep it alive." He looked at her, and then what? And then see what it turns into. He sat down on the other side of the hearth. He looked at the egg. He said, "You're not going to like what it turns into, Nessa. They're not like dogs. They're not like anything." "I know." "Then why?" She thought about that. She'd been thinking about it since the river bank. She said, "Because it was trying to get out and it couldn't, and I was right there." Pell was quiet. He understood this, because she had said the same thing the first time she'd pulled him out of a winter ditch when he was 6 and she was 14, because it was trying to get out and it couldn't, and she'd been right there. The egg cracked open at midnight. Nessa was awake. Pell had fallen asleep in the chair across from the fire, which was a thing he had always done since he was small, fallen asleep, wherever he sat, deeply and without warning, like a man with a very clean conscience. The hatchling that came out was the size of a large cat. Its scales were pale brown, the color of river clay. It had too many limbs for a few minutes, couldn't sort out what went where, kept folding itself back up like a thing that wasn't sure yet if it wanted to exist. Then it sorted itself out and sat very still in the center of the blanket and looked at Nessa. Its eyes were dark green, the color of water under trees. She did not speak to it. She did not move fast. She reached out one hand slowly and held it flat near the edge of the blanket, the way you offered a hand to something you wanted to trust you. The hatchling looked at her hand for a long time. Then it put its chin on her palm. Pell woke up an hour later, looked at the hatchling asleep across Nessa's feet, and said nothing for long enough that it was its own kind of answer. "I'm calling it Bryn," Nessa said. "Why Bryn?" "Because it looks like a Bryn." He looked at its small, pale, curled into a tight knot, making a low vibrating sound that was either a purr or a growl, too quiet to tell the difference. "What do you need me to do?" he said. "Nothing yet. Keep quiet for as long as we can." "That's not going to be long." "I know," she said. "It never is." The secret lasted 4 months, which was 3 months and 3 weeks longer than Pell had expected. Nessa kept Bryn inside through winter, which was easy enough because no one in Dunmore visited anyone else in winter if they could help it. The cold came down off the northern ridge and settled into the valley like something that had decided to stay. People kept to their own fires. The roads iced over. Even the holders stayed indoors. In that time, Bryn grew. Not in the dramatic way that stories usually describe, not a sudden doubling, not a creature that swelled and changed overnight. Bryn grew the way children grow, which is to say mostly when you weren't looking, and you only noticed when something stopped fitting. The corner of the hearth stopped fitting, then the space under Nessa's workbench stopped fitting. By the end of the 3rd month, Bryn was taking up most of the room's floor when she slept, and Nessa had started keeping her chair on top of the table to have somewhere to sit. What Nessa didn't expect, what none of the old holder warnings had prepared her for, was that Bryn watched everything. Not the way a hunting animal watches, all focus and intent, the way a child watches. Bryn tracked the way Nessa moved through her morning routine, watched her hands when she worked leather or measured grain, watched Pell when he talked, eyes moving from his face to Nessa's face and back, following the conversation like someone learning the rules of a game. After 6 weeks, Bryn started making sounds that weren't hunger or discomfort, low sounds, shaped almost like the rhythm of speech, though not any word Nessa knew. "She's copying you," Pell said one evening. He'd been coming every few days, always after dark. "I know. That's interesting." "Yes. Or disturbing." "Both things can be true," Nessa said. On the first warm day of early spring, a child named Corin, 8 years old, the holder's second grandson, followed a cat that had followed a smell that led to Nessa's back window, and what he saw there made him stand completely still for almost a minute before he ran. By that evening, Holder Brast was at Nessa's door. Brast was 60 years old and had the kind of authority that came from never having needed to raise his voice. He didn't raise it now. He stood in her doorway and looked past her at Bryn, who was sitting at the back of the room with her chin on her knees, watching him. He said, "How long?" Nessa said, "Since January." He said, "You know the rule." She said, "Yes." He said, "The rule exists because people died, Nessa." "I know," she said. "That's not what this is." Brast looked at Bryn again. Bryn didn't move, didn't make a sound, just watched him with those dark green eyes. Brast had the expression of a man who had prepared a speech and was realizing it didn't apply. He said, "It's a dragon." Nessa said, "Her name is Bryn." Something moved in Brast's face that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite uncertainty. He said, "You've named it." "Yes." He stood there for another moment. Then he said, 3 days. I'll bring the others in 3 days and we'll decide together what happens. You understand that?" Nessa said she understood. After he left, Pell came out from the back room where he'd been standing very still. He said, 3 days isn't much." "No. Do you have a plan?" "I have the start of one." The next 2 days, Nessa did something no one in Dunmore expected. She opened her door. She let people come and see. Not all people, she chose carefully. The families who had lost most to the original dragon raids were not her first visitors. She went to the families who were frightened but fair-minded, the ones who complained about the holders in quiet voices, the ones who thought the rules had stopped being about safety and started being about control. She let them see Bryn. She let Bryn be what she was, curious, watchful, calm. She didn't perform anything. She just let people stand in the room and notice that they weren't afraid. One woman, a farmer named Holt, who had 3 sons and strong opinions about everything, stood in the doorway for 10 minutes without speaking. Then she said, "She's not what I thought." Nessa said, "No." Holt said, "What do you want from me?" Nessa said, I want you to come to the meeting in 3 days and say what you think. Holt looked at her, and what do I think? I think you think, Nessa said carefully, that 40 years is long enough to still be afraid of something that isn't happening. Holt was quiet. She looked at Bryn, who was watching her the way she always watched people, patient, still, like she was storing it away. You're taking a big risk, Holt said. I know, Nessa said, but I was right there when she was trying to get out. That matters to me. Holt left without committing to anything. She came to the meeting 3 days later. She brought both her neighbors. The meeting did not go the way Holder Brast planned. He had expected compliance, or at worst a small argument he could outlast. Instead, he found half the village sitting in the assembly hall with opinions, which was something the Holders had spent 30 years discouraging and had apparently not fully stopped. Nothing was settled that night, but the decision that had looked simple 3 days ago was no longer simple, and Brast knew it, and Nessa watched him know it. That was enough for now. Enough was always enough to start. The messenger arrived from the east on a grey morning in late spring, riding hard enough that his horse needed a week of rest afterward. His name was Save. He was 19, official courier for the regional assembly, and deeply unprepared for what he found in Dunmore. He had expected a small village with a problem. He found a small village with a dragon the size of a draft horse sitting in the open square eating fish, surrounded by children who were arguing about whose turn it was to give her the next one. Save sat on his horse at the edge of the square for a long time before he got down. The regional assembly's letter was addressed to the Holder families and concerned the dragon. Word had traveled. Word always traveled. The letter said the assembly was aware of the situation, that regional law was clear on the matter of wild dragons within settled boundaries, and that an assessor would arrive within 30 days to determine the correct course of action. Holder Brast read the letter in the assembly hall with Nessa sitting across from him and Pell standing near the door. When Brast finished reading, he set the letter on the table and smoothed it flat with one hand, which was a gesture Nessa had learned to read as him thinking something he didn't want to say yet. He said, the assessor has authority I don't have. You understand that? Nessa said, I understand that the assessor will have the same authority in 30 days that you have right now, which means the next 30 days matter. Brast looked at her. What are you planning? Nothing that breaks any law, she said. Nothing that you can object to. That's not the same as nothing I'll regret. No, she admitted, it isn't. What she was planning was education, which is the most quietly dangerous thing one person can do to a situation that powerful people want kept simple. She started with the history. She went to old Wynne, who was 76 and had been a girl during the original raids, and she asked her to talk, not to the Holders, not in the assembly hall, just to people. Wynne talked about what had actually happened 40 years ago, 2 nesting dragons who had claimed a hunting territory, a series of misunderstandings that escalated because no one had known how to read what a dragon was doing until it was already doing it, and a final confrontation that killed 7 people and drove the dragons away, but had left everyone so frightened that they'd made rules designed for that specific disaster, as if the disaster were a permanent condition of the world. Wynne said they weren't evil, they were nesting. We got too close to what they were protecting and they pushed us back. Nobody knew how to stop pushing. She said this to anyone who would listen. People listened. Meanwhile, Bryn kept being what she was. This was the thing Nessa had counted on most and explained least, that Bryn's best argument was Bryn. The dragon spent her days now moving through the village the way a very large, very calm presence moves, unhurried, curious, always watchful. She learned which people were afraid of her and gave them distance without being told. She learned which people were fascinated and let them get close. She sat in the sun outside the mill, and the miller's apprentice, a quiet young man named Don, started talking to her while he worked, not expecting answers, just keeping the rhythm of his day. After 2 weeks of this, Don said to Nessa, she understands more than she shows. I think so too, Nessa said. How much more? Nessa said, I'm not sure there's a ceiling. On the 20th day, a second messenger arrived. This one was not from the regional assembly. He was from the Eastern Ranges, which was not a place that sent messengers to villages like Dunmore, ever. He was older than Save, road-worn, and carried a sealed letter with a mark that made Holder Brast go pale when he saw it. The mark was a claw, 3 lines pressed into red wax. It was the mark used when someone in the hierarchy of dragonkind wished to communicate with humans in official capacity, not a threat, a contact. Nessa had not known such a thing existed, and from the look on Brast's face, neither had he. The letter, when translated, Save had just enough of the Eastern trading language to manage it, said this: a dragon of our blood is in your settlement. We are aware. We are watching. What you do with her will be noted. It was not signed. It did not need to be. Brast sat with the letter for the rest of the evening. Nessa sat with him, which he didn't ask for and didn't object to. At some point deep into the night, he said, You understand what's coming. The assessor, she said. Not just the assessor. Whatever the dragons decide to do, you've put this village in a position where forces much larger than us are paying attention. That's not always a safe thing to be. Nessa said, No, but invisible didn't keep us safe either. The raids happened when we were invisible. Nobody negotiated. Nobody knew how. Nobody had ever done it. Brast said, You think you can negotiate with a dragon? I think, she said carefully, that Bryn is the reason a dragon wanted to send us a letter rather than a fire, and I think we should not waste that. Brast looked at the letter. Then he looked at Nessa. He had the expression of a man who had spent 40 years being the most powerful person in a small place, learning in real time what that was actually worth. He said, What do you need from me? Your name, she said, on whatever I write back. He was quiet for a long moment, then he nodded just once. Outside, in the square, Bryn was lying in the dark with her head raised toward the eastern sky, watching something that wasn't visible. Her eyes, in the dark, caught no light at all, just 2 patches of deeper black in the black of the night. Nessa watched her from the window. Whatever was coming from that direction. The assessor came on day 28, 2 days early, which Nessa suspected was intentional. His name was Croft. He was a compact man in his 50s with a careful way of moving, like someone who had learned long ago that how you entered a room told people things you might not want them to know. He had an assistant who wrote everything down and a regional seal that opened conversations the way a key opens a lock, quickly, and whether the person inside was ready or not. He met Bryn in the first hour. He hadn't asked to. He'd been walking from the guest house to the assembly hall, and Bryn had been in the road. They stood about 40 feet apart. Bryn looked at him, he looked at Bryn. His assistant kept writing. Croft's face was very still. Then Bryn made the low-shaped sound she made when she was deciding something, turned, and walked away. Croft watched her go, then he looked at Nessa, who had been standing nearby not pretending she hadn't arranged this. He said, How old is she? 8 months, Nessa said. He said, That's the size of an 8-month hatchling. She eats a lot of fish. He almost smiled. He looked at his assistant's notes. Then he said, I'd like to begin. The formal session was held in the assembly hall with the holders, Nessa, Pell, Old Win, and Don the miller's apprentice, who Nessa had brought because he was calm and had more direct hours with Bryn than almost anyone else. Croft's opening position was what regional law required him to say, that a dragon within settled bounds was a danger, that the law existed for good reason, that he had authority to order removal. Nessa let him finish. Then she said, Before you assess the danger, may I ask what information you have about what Bryn has actually done? Croft said, Done. To anyone, in 8 months. Croft consulted his notes. He said, Property concerns, fear of risk. The letter from the Eastern Dragons represents an escalation. The letter from the Eastern Dragons, Nessa said, is the first time any organized body of dragonkind has communicated with Dunmore in 40 years, including during the original raids, when communication would have saved 7 lives. She let that settle. Then she said, "You were sent here to remove a danger. I'm asking you to first determine if there is one." Wynne spoke next. She talked for 20 minutes about what she had actually seen during the raids, not the story that had grown around it, not the policy it had become, but what she had seen with her own eyes as a girl. What a cornered nesting pair actually did, what the warning signs had been that no one had known to read. She was specific. She named dates. She named the people who died and how. She talked about the last moment before the final confrontation, when the male dragon had stopped, had actually stopped and waited, and the group of men had rushed forward anyway, because by that point everyone was too frightened to read anything correctly. Croft listened to all of it. Then Don spoke. He hadn't prepared anything. He stood up and said simply that he'd spent more time with Bryn than anyone except Nessa, and that in his experience, she did one specific thing he hadn't seen any animal do. She adjusted to you. She read what you were feeling and she changed her behavior to make space for it. When he'd been upset about a problem at the mill, she'd sat at a distance and been quieter. When he'd been in good spirits, she'd moved closer. He said, "I don't know what that means exactly, but it doesn't seem like a danger. It seems like someone paying attention." Croft wrote something down. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I need to see her interact with someone who's afraid of her." Nessa said, "I know exactly the right person." Holder Brast was not someone who had ever been afraid of much, but the original raids had killed his uncle and his uncle's 2 workers, and Brast had been 14 when it happened. He had not been building his dragon policy out of nothing. He came to the square in the late afternoon knowing what Nessa was asking him to do and hatting it with the kind of specific dignity that men his age had when they were about to do something that cost them. He walked to within 30 feet of Bryn and stopped. Bryn looked at him, her head tilted, the way it tilted when she was working something out. She stayed where she was, didn't approach, didn't retreat. She made no sound. Brast stood there. His breathing was a little fast. His hands were at his sides, very still, in the way that people hold themselves still when they're managing something internal. Bryn lay down. Not as a display, not performed. She simply lowered herself to the ground, slowly, in the way large things lie down, and rested her chin on the stone and watched him from below, making herself smaller, making herself level, making herself, as best she could without words, something that was not a threat. Brass stood in the square for a long time. Croft stood beside Nessa and watched. The assistant's pen had stopped moving. Brass said, "Not to anyone in particular, she knows." Nessa said quietly, "Yes. She knows I'm afraid." "Yes." He looked at Bryn, lying in the square with her green eyes watching him from the ground. He said, "That's not what I expected." Nessa said, "No, it usually isn't." Croft made his notes that evening. He said nothing about what was in them. He ate dinner alone at the guest house and was very quiet the whole next morning, which Pell said was either a good sign or a very bad one. Nessa said she thought it was a man working out how to write a report that didn't fit inside the form he'd been given to write it. She was right, it took him 2 days. Croft's report recommended no removal action. It recommended instead a formal review period of 1 year, during which Dunmore would be monitored, Bryn would be documented, and the regional assembly would determine whether to draft new guidance, not a rule, guidance, for handling dragons in settled areas on a case-by-case basis. It was not a victory. Nessa knew better than to call it a victory. It was a door opened 1 inch by a man who had looked at something he couldn't fit into his forms and decided that was the form's problem. Croft left on a Thursday. By Saturday, the Eastern Dragon arrived. She came at dusk, from the direction of the high ridge, descending in a long, slow spiral that gave everyone watching enough time to be terrified, and then gradually less terrified, and then something past terror that didn't have a good name. She was enormous. Not the largest thing Nessa had ever heard of. Stories existed, always, of larger, but enormous in the way that made the word mean something again, after years of it being used for hills and storms and men who took up too much room at a table. Her scales were dark gold, the color of old honey. She landed in the field north of the village and folded her wings and waited. Bryn walked toward her immediately. Nobody stopped her, nobody could have, and nobody tried. Bryn crossed the field with the unhurried step she'd developed in the square, that calm large creature walk that was starting to feel like a personality, and stopped about 20 feet from the elder dragon and sat down. What followed was not something anyone watching could fully interpret. The elder dragon looked at Bryn. Bryn looked back. Neither moved. There were sounds, low, structured, like the rhythm of a conversation heard through a wall that went on for a long time. Then the elder dragon looked at the village, at the people standing at the field's edge, at the square behind them where Bryn's outline was visible in the worn stone, at the mill, the well, the assembly hall, the guest house where Croft had slept for 4 days. She looked at Nessa. Nessa did not know how she knew. She did not have a word for how you know when something ancient and vast is specifically looking at you, but she knew. She stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. She walked to the middle of the field. She stopped at a distance she judged was respectful, and she stood there, and she did not look away. The elder dragon lowered her head, not all the way to the ground, not the way Bryn had lowered herself for Brast, just enough, a degree, the kind of acknowledgement that means something exactly because it costs something. Nessa felt the air move. A sound reached her, not speech, not anything human language had a structure for, but something with weight and direction. She would spend years afterward trying to describe it. The closest she ever got it was the sound of being found acceptable. Pell was beside her when she walked back. He said, "What just happened?" She said, "I think we passed something. I don't know exactly what." "Is it over?" She thought about that. Bryn was still in the field, still sitting near the elder dragon, and from a distance they looked comfortable together in the way of things that have been apart for a long time and are catching up. "No," she said, "I think it's beginning." The elder dragon left before dawn. She made no sound departing. The first anyone knew she was gone was the cold that filled the space she'd occupied. Bryn came home and slept for 14 hours. When she woke up, something was different. Not obviously, not in the way of a change that could be named immediately. But over the following days, Nessa noticed that Bryn was speaking more. Not in human language, and not in any way that could be transcribed, but in the shaped sounds she had always made. And now there were more of them, and they were organized differently. And when she made them, she watched the person she was making them to with an intensity that felt like she was checking whether something had landed. Don, who spent every afternoon in her company, came to Nessa at the end of that first week and said, "I think she's trying to teach me something." Nessa said, "What makes you think that?" He said, "Because she keeps doing the same sound until I do something, and then she changes to a different one, like a lesson, like how you'd teach a child a word." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what the sounds mean, but I think she knows that I don't know, and I think that's the point of it." Nessa sat with that for a long time. The elder dragon had come and spoken with Bryn. After that, Bryn had started trying to communicate. Not casually, not the way she had before, not as a creature that made sounds near people, but deliberately, with clear intent, building something that looked like language between herself and the humans she spent her days with. She was building a bridge, and she was building it from her side. Nessa told Pell that night. He sat with it the way he sat with most things, thoroughly, without rushing. Then he said, "She's not just being kept, she's choosing." "Yes," Nessa said. "That's different from anything the old stories say about dragons." "Yes, because the old stories," he said slowly, "were told by people who never got close enough to find out what a choice looked like." Nessa looked at him. She said, "You're smarter than people give you credit for." He said, "You raised me. I learned from watching." Outside, the sun was down and Bryn was in the square, and the miller's apprentice Don was sitting on the steps of the well and making a sound, carefully and badly, that he had learned from a dragon, and the dragon was watching him with her dark green eyes and waiting to see if he'd get it right. The year passed, then a second one began. Croft came back, as promised, at the end of the review period, and this time he brought 2 other assessors with him. They were not there to question the first report. They were there because 3 other villages had written to the assembly asking what Dunmore had done. That surprised Nessa. She had not expected to become an example. It turned out that Dunmore was not the only place where something unexpected had happened. A village called Reth, 2 days east, had a young male dragon who had been using a shepherd's field as a sleeping ground for 2 winters. The shepherd had complained, and then stopped complaining, and when the assembly sent someone to investigate, they found that the young dragon had started moving the sheep away from weak points in the fence without being asked, apparently because he'd watched the shepherd do it enough times that he'd understood what it was for. In a coastal settlement called Faro, a sea dragon had been spotted watching the fishermen with so much consistency that the fishermen had eventually started leaving fish on a particular rock, and the dragon had started, in return, driving schools toward the nets. Nobody had planned this. Nobody had negotiated it. It had simply grown, the way things grow when you leave them alone long enough and don't ruin them with fear. Croft sat at Nessa's table and spread his notes out and said, "We have a larger problem than one village with one dragon." Nessa said, "I think you mean a larger opportunity." He said, "I think I mean both at once." The assembly's formal session happened in the capital 3 months later. Nessa went. Pell came with her, which she hadn't asked for and didn't argue with. Holdebrast also came, which was the thing that surprised everyone, not Nessa though. She had watched him in the square that afternoon when Bryn had laid herself down on the stone, and she had seen what that had cost him and what it had given him, and she had known since then that Brast was a man who had been waiting, without knowing it, for the evidence to change. The session was large and loud, and full of people who had strong opinions and less information. Nessa had expected this. She had brought Wynn's written account of the original raids, Croft's 2 years of observations, Don's careful notes on the communication attempts, and a map of every confirmed dragon-human interaction in the region over the last 10 years that had not ended in conflict. There were more than anyone in that room expected. Most of them had never been reported because they were small, and because in small moments people tended not to ask why. They just noted it and moved on. She did not make a speech. She had written one and thrown it away, because the more she read it, the more it sounded like someone trying to win an argument, and winning arguments with people who were frightened was not the same as changing anything real. Instead, she talked the way she had talked to Brast, to Holt, to Wynn, directly, without theatre. She said what she knew. She said what she didn't know. She said, "For 40 years we taught ourselves that there was nothing to learn from dragons except to stay away from them. And then a hatchling came out of a cracked egg in a riverbank, and she's been learning from us every day since. I think we should ask ourselves which of us is actually falling behind." The room was not silent after this. Rooms full of officials are rarely silent, but something shifted in it, a subtle weight change, the way air shifts in a room when a window is opened somewhere. It took 2 more sessions and 4 months of drafting. What came out was not a law. It was a framework, provisional, subject to revision, full of qualifications that made Nessa want to grind her teeth. It said that dragons in settled areas were to be assessed individually, that removal was not the default action, that communities who had established peaceful contact could apply for formal recognition of that contact, and that a group of readers and recorders would be assembled to start building, properly, a language guide for human-dragon communication based on Don's notes and whatever else could be gathered. It was imperfect. Nessa had expected it to be imperfect. She had a practical understanding of what the start of things looked like, which is to say, not like an ending. She came home to Dunmore in early spring. Bryn was in the square when the cart came down the road. She raised her head and looked at Nessa and made the sound that Don had spent 2 years learning to recognize as a greeting, a specific, shaped sound that Nessa had never been able to reproduce correctly, but that Bryn made for her anyway, with the same patience she brought to everything. Nessa got down from the cart and walked to the square and put her hand on Bryn's neck, in the familiar way she had put her hand there 1,000 times. Bryn leaned into it slightly, which was also familiar. Pell said from behind her, "What now?" Nessa looked at the square, at the stone worn smooth where Bryn slept. At the steps of the well where Don had sat for 2 years making bad sounds that got slowly less bad. At the road that led north to the ridge where a great gold dragon had once descended at dusk and found a village that had not run. She said, "We keep going." Bryn made a sound that was not a word in any human language, but it had weight, it had direction, and after 2 years of listening, Nessa understood that it meant, yes, obviously, what else would we do? The world had not changed because a human woman pulled an egg from a river bank, but it had noticed, and noticing, sometimes, was how the slow work of changing the world actually began.